The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. Did you catch that? God treats Elijah to a gale force wind, but God wasn't in the wind. Now you see, the wind, if God was there, that was something Elijah could understand. It was something the Hebrew people could understand, something we can understand. It wasn't what Elijah was expecting. The wind, the breath of God, the ruach of God. They had seen this before. It was the wind that opened the Red Sea and closed it again. The wind that opened the waters so the Israelites could escape from Egypt and then closed again with the wind to defeat their enemies. The wind that dried up the floodwaters after 40 days and 40 nights of rain. It was the wind that brought the plague of locusts, and the wind took them away again. It was the wind that brought quail to the complaining Israelites on their journey, and the wind that brought rain that ended a 3.5-year drought in Israel. They were used to God in the wind. They could expect God in the wind. The wind speaks of God's power and God's change. But this was not a gentle summer breeze for them. This wind ripped the mountains apart and broke the boulders in pieces. We all thank God for the gentle breezes of his love for us. But sometimes we need a little bit more than that. Sometimes we need more than a gentle breeze. Sometimes we need a mountain smashing, rock splitting tsunami, a wind that we have never seen before blowing through our lives. Sometimes we need a hurricane and a tornado to make us sit up and pay attention. Breathe on me, breath of God. Some of you, a lot of you will know that that's when God came into my life and said, "I want you to be a minister." I sang that hymn as I walked outside on a May day, and I said, "Breathe on me, breath of God," and he did, and here I am. Life changing, the wind that rips through us. But on this day, God was not in the wind. Courtney, you're up. Then God shakes the ground with a terrifying earthquake. Now this they could understand. The God who created the world could shake it up. The God who controls us could shake us. They could expect God in the earthquake. Fear God, certainly, but they could expect and understand God in this. Raw, powerful, amazing, absolutely what they would and could expect from the God who controls everything. There was a great shaking. The plates in the ground were shifting and everything was moving. And here, yes, here was where Elijah would expect to encounter God. But God wasn't in the earthquake. Elijah didn't sense that God was in the shifting and the moving. But sometimes he is, figuratively. Sometimes God does things to get our attention. He shakes our world He rocks our world. And sometimes it's not in a good way. And sometimes we ask God, why? Why do we find you in the earthquake? Why do we find you in the times in our lives where we're hurting, where things are askew, and we don't have the answers? Sometimes God isn't in the earthquake. Then God sent a devastating fire, but God wasn't in the fire either. He is the God of the elements, wind, earth, fire, and yet he wasn't doing what Elijah expected. He wasn't doing what we expect. But I ask you, does God ever do what we expect? Not often. Last of all, after the wind, after the earthquake, after the fire, last of all, Elijah hears a gentle whisper, a still, small voice. Here was God in the unexpected. Do you know what God was trying to tell Elijah in those moments? I have the power to destroy anything on the face of the earth. There is nothing that can stand against me. I am mighty, I am holy, I am righteous, I am bigger than you are. That's what the wind and the earthquake and the fire were all about. But in that gentle whisper, in that still small voice, what God was telling Elijah was this: I am powerful, but I care for you. I know you're frail, I know you're weak, but I love you and I care for you. God appeared to Elijah with might and with power, and he whispered, I'm bigger than you are. And because I'm bigger, I have the power and the ability to protect you from anyone and anything, because I love you. The psalmist says, as a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him. For he knows we are formed, he remembers we are dust. In the still, small voice, God is there. I want to tell you a story about a young man. He'd lost his job, didn't know which way to turn, and he went to see his old preacher. Old not being me. And he was pacing around the preacher's office, and the young man was ranting about his problem. And we rant about our problems, don't we? Finally, he clenched his fist and shouted, I begged God to say something to me. Tell me, preacher, why doesn't God answer? And the preacher said something from across the room. So hushed was it that it was indistinguishable. And the young man came closer, halfway across the room. He said, what did you say? And the preacher repeated himself again in the softest whisper. So the young man moved closer until he was leaning right on the preacher's chair. And he said, what did you say? And the preacher said to him, sometimes God whispers, so we'll get closer to him. We all wish that God would speak to us loudly and clearly. We wish that God would rent a PA system like this one and we would hear him. If it would, you know how they used to go around the streets and have that PA system answer the questions we have? We wish that God would take out a giant billboard on the QEW or the 406 and just put the answers to the questions we have. We all wish that God would bust into our world bust into our lives and give us some concrete answers to all the questions that we have, the nagging problems of our lives. We wish he would just tell us why. Why hasn't he chosen to heal us yet? Why hasn't he chosen to mend our financial needs? Why hasn't he chosen to save the ones that we love? Why does he do what he does? We wish there was no guesswork involved. We wish that the answers were just there to everything we want to know. And we come to him and say, God, give us a sign. And we expect the fire and the earthquake and the wind. But we don't listen for the still, small voice. We want him to just yell out the answers so that we could escape the cloud of confusion and the doubts and the uncertainty, because it's frustrating not to know what to do. If only he would give us some sign, something big and tangible, like the fire or the earthquake or the wind. But he whispers. He whispers, so we will draw closer to him. Perhaps there's a reason for that. Nothing draws us closer than a whisper. A good teacher, instead of standing up at the front of the classroom and yelling, will whisper, and quiet will come upon the room. If we listen, if we draw closer to God in the still, small voice, if we are closer to God, then we will have the answers we need. Listen to the whisper. Listen to the still, small voice. He says to us, be still and know that I am God. Be still and listen. Listen to the quiet.